Hello and welcome to the UNSW Law Journal Forum. I'll be speaking here today with Doctors Cristy Clark and John Page, who have kindly agreed to speak with the journal about their recent book. Cristy is Associate Professor with the University of Canberra Law School. She has published widely on fields such as legal geography, environmental rights, and property. John is currently a Professor of Law at UNSW. As a matter of fact, this is his first week at the law school. He has written widely on property law, critical property theory, and similar topics. Cristy and John have published with both the UNSW Law Journal before, and have a recent book entitled The Lawful Forest, A Critical History of Property, Protest, and Spatial Justice from the Edinburgh University Press. The book is an eclectic and interdisciplinary critical analysis of space, property, and the ordering of land under our neoliberal paradigm. It unpacks the dominant property ideology, the Othelian model of exclusion and alienation of private property, and calls for a more relational and shared model of public space, harking back to the idea of the commons. Through this, the image of the lawful forest is deployed as an alternative means of ordering our relationship with land. Uh, if the authors, Cristy and John, could discuss a little bit about the basic argument of the book. So what exactly is the lawful forest, and what does it say about our relationship with land and space?
Well, thanks, Jack. Thanks for this opportunity for this interview. The basic argument of our book is that there is a dominant story about our spatial ordering, and it's one that's about enclosure, it's about private rights, it's about individualism, exclusion, and that story has come to be the dominant story, such that it almost obscures and hides property's counter-narrative, which is about inclusion, it's about communitarianism, the point of the book was to say that there are many aspects to the story of property, and there's strong links to protest, there's strong links to claims of spatial justice, but that there is this counter narrative, and that by taking a critical perspective on the history of our relationships with place and space, we can identify, as you say, idiosyncratic or eclectic kind of instances where there has been a kind of a pushback against enclosure, a pushback against erasure, about trying to find an alternate path forward to describe our relationships with space and place. So that is, I suppose, it's a chronicling of these incidents, of these continuities, which we can spot across history. The history of, for example, the common law of property, where we can see that there is, instances where people reject this kind of, unidirectional kind of story and want to embrace other ways of relating to place and space. So the lawful forest for us was both fact and metaphor, I suppose, but it's particularly strong or resonant as a metaphor, that it's about describing this other way, this alt narrative of this communitarian, inclusive way of relating to space and place that is not necessarily individualistic or exploitative, and so on. So it is about, it's primarily a metaphor. It's also fact that sometimes a lot of law has come out of forest law, for instance. The Forest Charter is something which we hark back to from the 13th century. So some of these stories have actually sprung out of people that live in or near the forest. And the sense of it being a lawful forest is that we're making the point that we're not just kind of being, nostalgic or trying to be idealistic about this, but these are narratives, these are principles, these are doctrines which are lawful, which come from the law. And as such, it's simply we've kind of lost sight of them, So we play a lot with, losing sight of the forest with the trees and these kind of sayings, I suppose. But this kind of alternative description of our relationship to space and place is something which we have kind of lost sight of, or it's hiding there in plain sight. So That is kind of the basic argument behind the book, and why we use this or employ this metaphor of lawful forest.
That's certainly a very interesting and novel way of looking at a lot of these issues, particularly where we're in a particular moment of socioeconomic crisis where the commons has historically been wiped out by private capital, and it's only getting worse as even at the turn of the 21st century. Is that something that spurred on this development of this metaphor, or this both fact and metaphor, the lawful forest?
Yeah, look, certainly there's an element to which we felt that some of these stories, while having always been significant and always been important to people to the extent that they, resulted in revolutions or attempted civil wars and things, that we were really reaching a bit of a climax in terms of some of the crises that you've described, and obviously the climate crisis being chief amongst them. And this sort of idea that it's very clear that it's the result of a particular way of relating to land, an extractive and exclusionary competitive approach to relating to land that's really taken us to the brink. But that we have at our fingertips access to these alternative ways of relating to land and relating to each other that may be far more sustainable and that may be far more inclusive both of each other, but also inclusive of the survival of the rest of the planet, our habitat. So it did bring a particular sense of urgency or sense of importance to some of the themes that we were exploring, and a need to really draw on those lessons from history, and that sense that we didn't have to go looking elsewhere. We could really find it from within practices that not only had we practiced throughout history, but we still were. We just weren't paying attention to them in the same way because they didn't take up as much space in the narrative. They weren't as dominant in terms of the kind of the doctrine and the sense of what was official in the story of law.
No, that's certainly that's certainly great. And I suppose this sort of ties into what were the particular origins, the intellectual origins of this book and your ideas, and thinking about space and tying it to those historical episodes. And how did you arrive at the forest as like the centralizing metaphor or image of the book?
Yeah, is it okay if I take this one, Jeff? So, as you mentioned, we originally published an article in the UNSW Law Journal that was sort of the seeds of this book. And the seeds of that article was a judgment of the High Court of Australia, Brown and the State of Tasmania, which is a constitutional law case. It's about the implied freedom of political communication. But the majority of the judges writing their own judgments for that case, in the background, almost just as obiter, mentioned this concept of the public forest estate. And it's really the existence of the public forest estate which laid the groundwork for why it was problematic that the law was unclear in relation to where people could and couldn't be, and that protest particularly was being targeted by the laws in question, the anti-protester laws that were invalidated in the judgment. And John and I had been talking previously around this intersection of property rights and protest, and that there was this really interesting intersection between the public expectation to share public space and common space for the purposes of a whole range of things, but particularly in terms of protest, and how significant that was to democracy. So we were at the same law faculty at the time, and I had the judgment and noticed this public forest estate, and I thought, this is what we've been talking about. This is exactly the point. And look at this just being recognised offhand, like it's no big deal by the court here. It's just this sort of idea. And where does this idea come from? Because they mention in the judgment that it had been long recognised in Tasmanian legislation And obviously, when something's recognised rather than created through legislation, the implication there is that it existed previously. So I ran down the corridor with this judgment in my hand and said, John, we have to look at this. We have to, this is it. And we started to have a look, and we really, through looking back through history, we thought, actually, the only real origin that makes sense in terms of what they're talking about here is the Forest Charter of 1217, which is the Magna Carta's sort of communitarian twin. And what that did was it pushed back against the Norman forest laws, the forest laws which enclosed and closed off afforested land, which didn't necessarily mean land with trees, but lands which had been treated as the commons by villagers and by communities, and turned them into sort of a private gaming park for royalty. And this was so unpopular and considered to be so egregious to people's sense of what was lawful and right, that it led to the Forest Charter, which handed back common rights to massive swaths of the English countryside. And it became clear that this must have been the origin of it, because that had remained good law in England basically ever since, and had been inherited in Australia, through colonisation and through invasion, but through the common law system. And really, that's where the forest became so central, and also why history became so central.
No, that's certainly fascinating. I think when you discussed it in the book, it was Justice Gageler's judgment in Brown, where that throwaway reference to recognized customary rights is made, and it seems, tying back to John's earlier remark about like a ghostly sort of traces of these alternative ideas or these alternative ways of thinking about things. They crop up from time to time, and they're not really given much spotlight until something like your book comes out. The Forest Charter is another good example. Everybody knows about the Magna Carta, but that was really, for want of a better term, like an aristocratic document. It refers to the barons and it refers to the bishops, whereas the Forest Charter is really about the commons and people's communal rights, which I have to admit, this was the first time I had found out about the Forest Charter through both your article and your book, and it's certainly very interesting. And it challenges a lot, I think, about not only the development of land law from as something that is really centralized about like tenure and the idea that it all comes from the king or like a central authority. So, and this emphasis on history and alternative or lesser known parts of historical episodes where these ideas come from. Why and how did you approach this historical analysis? Because your book doesn't just talk about Norman history. It probably spans about 700 years from across the world. So you discuss uh, the early Tudor period, or even the period before that, so the War of the Roses and the peasant rebellions during then, that we read about in like Shakespeare's plays. And then you go into the English Civil War and Cromwell and the religious Reformation and all those alternative groups coming up, espousing very radical ideas. And then you go into 1870s Paris with the Paris Commune, and then from that you fast forward to 100 years with the Age of Aquarius and the countercultural hippie movement in New South Wales, which is a great historical adventure. But I was wondering exactly how you're able to synthesize all these historical episodes and do them in a way that was very sensitive. So you really did pay attention to a lot of the historiographical literature about this, and it's certainly, I can't imagine something that took place overnight, but the product of a lot of discussion and thought.
Yes. Well, look, we do bounce around. You're right. And we start the book with post-industrial Detroit as well. So early 21st century Detroit. So we do. We as you've very accurately described the various kind of passages through time, and they're not necessarily chronological. So we're trying to refute the idea that all of this enclosure narrative is simply a linear narrative, which has an inexorable kind of outcome. So we picked moments in time which seem somewhat eclectic and, sporadic perhaps, but these were moments when we could kind of discern more clearly these what critical geographers, for example, have described as recurring continuities. And by selecting these particular moments where there was pushback against the enclosing tendencies of privileged, powerful people, is where we kind of selected. It wasn't meant to be an exhaustive historical study. It was very much meant to be just on moments. And I think if you really are attuned to it, if you see this kind of counter narrative, if you see the lawful forest in our midst, you can see ongoing kind of instances of these kind of recurring continuities. You just have to see it in any sort of urban context with community food gardens or so on, these kind of different ways of relating to space and place. So look, these were narratives, some well known, some not well known. And there wasn't any, it just seemed that these were instances that told the narrative well. I think is possibly why we selected those particular episodes. And, there were reasons why. For example, I wrote the chapter also led the chapter, should I say, around the Aquarian era, and that was, I suppose, an area of particular scholarship interest. So there was, I suppose, some biases or prejudices or whatever that you fed into the story. But I think this is a good example of how this particular thing works. But yeah, I think that there was, no grand design around it. It simply showed or exemplified this particular alt narrative.
We were also really conscious of the fact that we didn't want to be making a really simplistic argument, that there was sort of enclosure that operated in a very set way and an alternative narrative which had a very set of rules and kind of a really narrow way of operating, and particularly not that it had to be rural and it had to be more community based, but that in fact many of the principles that you could see this level of continuity in had moved into larger places, but also had moved into urban places, even quite early in terms of the urban enclosure riots. But particularly that there was a real thread in terms of more recent scholarship around the right to the city, which really reflects our kind of theories around the lawful forest. And so the Paris Commune, for example, was for us a site where we could really illustrate some of those continuities, and you could see some of those linkages in terms of that sort of theoretical thinking that had gone on behind why people acted in the way that they did. But it also, in many ways, I think these were moments where this kind of bubbling tension that we've identified in the book between these two different ways of relating to place and to each other sort of burst through the surface. They were not possible to ignore in those sort of moments of eruption, things like the Paris Commune or Kett's Rebellion, where really England was sort of sitting on the brink of civil war, and of course the Civil War itself. And so there were moments when it was impossible to ignore the reality that there was incredibly impassioned belief in these alternative rights. But we probably had many more that we discussed and talked about, but there's obviously limited capacity in one book to explore all of them at the depth that we would like to. And so these were the ones we felt kind of illustrated the themes holistically in a way that we really wanted to. And no doubt also that really particularly captured our interest, and that we, really did want to spend that many months really digging into and exploring in depth.
No, that's fascinating. Was there a particular, I suppose, historical anecdote or historical episode that you covered that you found particularly interesting or representative of some of the themes that you were trying to capture?
Well, I think, I suppose, the Diggers is a well-known story, and I think that and Jared Winstanley, and that the there's the strange kind of moment that erupted on St. George's Hill, and that is a particular story that is well known, and I suppose but there was many fascinating lesser known kind of historical instances that led up to the Diggers that also were extremely emblematic of these kind of moments of rupture. So I think each story was different. Each had its own idiosyncrasies, but they all had these kind of recurring commonalities as well. And I think it was finding the common threads that was really interesting for us in joining the dots and linking them together.
I was fascinated by those things that made the common threads and the theory kind of link up. So things like, around the time of the Diggers, there happened to have been reduced regulation on the printing presses. So then suddenly political pamphlets were more able to be printed and widely distributed. And so this capacity to share ideas, radical ideas, in a different way was something that really then led into the kinds of things that then occurred, not just from the Diggers, but also throughout the kind of the Civil War era. And that also featured in terms of there were different moments earlier in time when there was less control over the clergy. And so radical clergy were able to travel and to preach quite radical ideas. They were religious ideas, but they had really radical implications in terms of society and rules and ways of relating to each other and place and to power. And so all of these moments when there was kind of a reduction of authoritarian control over people's dissemination of ideas led directly to these moments of rupture that we sort of explored. And I found those linkages really interesting as well. And those little anecdotes about the significance of a particular press and things like that. I really liked uncovering those details.
Yeah, no, that's uh, from a historian's perspective, very interesting, because even in the book itself, when you're discussing the earlier period of the peasant rebellions during the 13th century, 13th and 14th century, we see the Lollards, and like the first attempt by an independent, well, not an independent clergyman, but a dissident clergyman, attempting many of those things that were later to figure out 300 years later. So that's and you can probably see those connections in other discussion, other aspects and discussions in your book. With the Paris Commune, for example, I found that quite interesting in the way that you framed it, because the Paris Commune might perhaps be most well known for uh, uh, the first international. In the history of communism and socialism, the Paris Commune occupies a very special and very important place, and it's probably like inspired one of Karl Marx's most important writings. But your approach was to focus it with a lens um, of this kind of radical reclamation of a right to the city, or that would later be prefigured by Henri Lefebvre. Is this approach, I suppose, to taking these historical events and looking at them through, I suppose, a more convex mirror, or through a particular lens, um, uh, was that a process that you found challenging, given the fact that these were also historical moments that also have their own sites of historiographical debate and historical um, literature that is very extensive in and of itself?
Actually, it's really interesting. Is it almost from the moment that we started writing the original article, this particular kind of lens of really kind of seeing this through the lens of this, how people relate to space and how people relate to this sort of idea of communitarian, this sort of commons. it became such a clear lens, such a strong way of looking at things that it would be in everyday conversation that we'd think of something and say, "Oh my goodness, can you say it?" It would just that convex lens that you describe. It's a lovely way of putting it, actually, because it became very strong, and it was almost the opposite. It was almost as though it was very difficult to see it from a different perspective once you were really immersed in that. And perhaps that was one of the challenges with limiting how many, stories or case studies that we included in the book, because suddenly everything became so significant and needed that exploration. Obviously Occupy could have featured in a really strong way here, but once that kind of clicked into place, it actually became very easy to see it through that lens and to read everything through that lens, as though you sort of felt as though everyone also had that in the back of their mind, but we're just talking about something else for some other reason. So that was my experience, at least. How about you, John?
Yeah, look, I think it's a great way of looking at it too. It's sort of looking through the rear vision mirror. But some things were kind of hard to look backwards into, particularly an early chapter, around the ancient forest, and where there was a kind of a dearth of the written record, and this need to kind of, sort on the forest floor the customary bases for various things, and a lot of second guessing, I suppose. So that was also an intriguing kind of, excursion into a form of history and law fact finding, by just sort of drawing inferences and relying on common rights and certain ancient written instruments and so on. So yes, I mean, and I think we quoted somewhere some line from another particular author about the things in the rear vision mirror appear a lot closer than they actually are. There's that kind of little thing that you see, particularly in the US on high cars and so on. But and I think that's true, that but by looking backwards, it seems so very long ago, but actually they're probably much closer than they appear.
That's a very interesting methodology. I mean, I suppose, like, in some ways, it all naturally falls into place once you've got a particular set of lenses to look through. And just on connecting all these historical episodes in the way that you have, I, am I correct in saying that the ultimate exercise here is to show that a lot of the features of our property ideology, our relationship with land, and our the impact of capital, these developments, because of those alternative episodes in history, were not historically inevitable. There was always an element of contingency in the way that how we got here, and is in pushing forward that message. Do you think the time that we're currently living in might see other historical contingencies that might transform or might have a different result to a lot of the to a lot of the features of this the domination of capital, the focus on alienation and exclusion, the equation of private property with freedom, with things such as what's happening now with a greater push towards the recognition of indigenous sovereignty, our looming ecological crises. Do you think there's a possibility now for history? I don't sound like a Hegelian, but like for history to come alive again.
Well, I think that was, look, a key motivating reason to write the book, to make the point that the proponents of enclosure would like you to believe that that everything is preordained. There's a linear pattern to all this. That that this particular outcome is inevitable and inexorable. But we wanted to say that, look, no, it could have gone another way. There could have been, the sliding doors moment where we could have taken another path. And I think that by reminding people of the lawful forest, where we're saying in the present moment of crises that there are other ways of at least relating to land and to space and place, and all of the finitudes around it, is something which we're running out of, and there, this is a existential moment to particularly confront the argument that we're on this kind of linear preordained path, which is just going to drive us off the cliff, so to speak.
The other thing that I think is really interesting is that in almost every single one of the stories that we explore, the thing that stopped us from taking the alternative path wasn't that it was unappealing or that it didn't work or non-functional. It was elite violence. I mean, it was absolute crushing violence that stopped these experiments from having a life and continuing. And I think that's an extraordinarily strong argument for the idea that there's still a lot there to explore that's worth it, and that we have to be really clear about what it is that's stopping us. And it's not the lack of function, and it's not the fact that these things don't work or that they're not popular. It's the fact that there's a small number of people who benefit from a different way of doing things and who will use any means to try to maintain the status quo, or at least the hegemonic kind of system that supports what they would like. But that we really can't afford that. That we can't allow that to continue at this point, because we won't have a planet. We won't have a kind of a place to share.
No, that's a very sobering thought, especially where, and I think John mentioned earlier about how the book starts off with a sort of a narrative about the decline of even urban areas like Detroit, which have become due to the influence of capital and capital flight, completely degraded. Is that something in our moment, in our contemporary moment, where I suppose revolutionary violence, unlike the Paris Commune or the English Civil War, where at least in places like Australia or the United States or the United Kingdom, where revolutionary violence is not on everybody's lips as of yet, although things may change. What is there a particular path forward, or is there a particular way to capture that these pushes towards social change? Bearing in mind that I think later this year, we haven't had a set date yet. There will be the voice referendum, and is that also an instance of social change, which many of the themes this book can also shed light on?
I'll start. I think John might have more to add, but yeah, look, I think obviously the big difference now, as opposed to so many of those that we do identify, is the fact that we do now live in a democratic system, and the chapter on the age of the Aquarius did have a different outcome, and it had a different outcome because the government did in fact listen to the population. This wasn't a violent revolution; it was a peaceful protest, and it actually had a really positive outcome. And so I think giving people a voice is a really significant change. And in the Australian context, we talk about pluralism here within the common law. And one of the reasons why we were so at pains to point to the existence of legal pluralism within the common law is that we think that it provides the space for an incredible ease of recognition of broader legal pluralism. And when we're talking about stolen land and occupied country, that is incredibly significant. And the voice is a step towards that recognition, and that recognition of sovereignty and of legal pluralism. And when we're talking about learning lessons of how to relate to place and how to understand the connection between people and country, we have the oldest continuing legal system in the world here on this continent. And we have an example of a significant number of peoples who have in fact practiced this incredibly sustainable way of relating to place and caring for country, and understanding their connection to country back into history and beyond. So the voice is a really significant moment, really, and hopefully it is step one of a growing step towards really recognising that sovereignty and really giving voice and recognition to that legal pluralism that is so essential to the way forward for this country, for sure.
Yeah, I think in the chapter on that on the Age of Aquarius, there's a brief comparison with New Zealand and the way that they've incorporated some aspects of legal pluralism in their constitutional system, and the fact that they've endowed certain spaces with legal rights, and those are recognized. But that might be a model for something, at least here in Australia, we could look forward to. Um, bearing that in mind, I'm also I've also noticed throughout each of the chapters that it begins with a hand-drawn illustration of a particular tree. Um, I'll try to put it on the screen, but if that doesn't work, um, it'd be interesting to, because I found this very curious, because I was trying to figure out the connection between the topic of each chapter, or like the particular historical example the chapter discusses, with the kind of tree that is depicted in each of the chapter headings. And I was just wondering, if is there any significance to that? I'm sure there is, but how about yeah, how is that? What is their role in the overall scheme of your book?
Well, I suppose it's trying to bring the Lawful Forest to a visual form by, these line drawings. And I suppose each chapter has a particular link to the particular tree that we chose. So, for example, the chapter on Aquarian property forms and the counterculture and so on featured the Bangalow palm tree, which is a tree from the rainforest tree from northeastern New South Wales. And so it was meant to be, again, emblematic of that chapter. And for example, then I think chapter 2, the theory chapter, had the redwood, the Californian redwood. And again, in that chapter, there was a bit of a excursus off into the concept of the phenomenal tree. And if you want an example of a phenomenal tree, the redwood is phenomenal. And there was a certain, encounter with literature and the overstory and so on, which was about struggles and battles over protecting the redwood forests in Northern California and so on. So there are meant to be, so read the chapter, and hopefully the image at the beginning makes some sense. You can see the link. It's, again, just meant to be representative of perhaps where the chapter's going. And the oak tree, Cristy can probably speak to that.
The Ket's Rebellion, obviously, they meet and they hold their alternate government under the oak of the rebellion. And so that the chapter that includes these concrete utopias in chapter 4 also includes an oak at the beginning to kind of link into that oak of the rebellion in Ket's Rebellion, an oak that continues to exist today but now sits by the side of a highway.
Oh wow, it's that's like in Norfolk, right?
That's right.
The
Yeah.
old woodlands of, yeah. That's certainly very interesting, and certainly brings a lot of visual connection to many of the ideas that you've discussed. I'm also curious as to, there's a section in your book where you discuss, and this is relevant to Head's Rebellion that you just mentioned. You refer to Christopher Hill, the historian of the English Civil War, about that period having two revolutions. One was the aristocratic revolution that ultimately led up to Bill of Rights and the Glorious Revolution, and that succeeded, and that laid the foundation for our Anglo common law form of governance. But then you have the more, I suppose, proletarian revolution, which that's a bit of an anachronism, but a revolution that's led by the commons, the peasants, and these religious dissidents, that explored a lot of these utopian ideas, but which ultimately failed under the heel of state violence. I think having that engaging with the sort of distinction between the foundations of modern democracy, where that first revolution ultimately can be charted to arrive at. Do you think that within our current framework of liberal democracy, which for all its democratic virtues, it's still, I suppose, complicit in a lot of the issues that are facing us? Its relationship with capital, its thirst for development, and its rather slow-footed way of recognizing indigenous sovereignty, at least in our context. Do you think that a second revolution in that form, where outside of the democratic, liberal democratic framework, do you think that there is some possibility of that, given these historical examples?
I'll jump in, John, because you look like you're still thinking. I hope there is. And it depends on the day whether I think it's possible or not. But I think that in many ways, I mean, I think I said before, I don't think we have a choice. I think these are not just issues of justice, and they are absolutely issues of justice, but they're now issues of survival. And I think that's where it really comes to the point where we really don't have a choice but to take that alternative path and to kind of finish that shadow revolution. And I don't think it has to be a violent revolution, and I don't think it has to be a destructive one. I think it can be one of hope, but I think it's our best chance. What to describe as our best last chance sometimes. But yeah, I think it's really important that we hold on to that hope in terms of looking at a pathway forward. John, what do you think?
That's a very powerful message.
Look, I think you've also made a great point, Cristy, about the in the chapter in relation to the declaration of World Heritage Rainforests in northeastern New South Wales and so on, and the end of the logging of Turania Creek and everything. That was an expression of community protest, democratic will. So yes, I think that we do see these sort of oscillations of different influences, hopefully reaching the same, positive outcome.
No, that's very important for us, all of us, to hear in this day and age. And I suppose one last question related to that. A lot of the themes that you've discussed in your book, you ultimately say, and I think you mentioned this earlier, that they're supposed to be taken as a call for further examination or further analysis in the way we ultimately relate to space and land. Is there anything that's particularly important for us to look at, building off the foundation that you've laid with your book?
Yes, well, look, I think we need to have greater ownership of space, and the problem is that ownership of space in the private model is relegated to such a small percentage of the population. So, in several of the chapters, we talk about the absolute dominance of private ownership in England, where some 92% of lands are owned by a small number of landholders.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to, and that's what, for example, the COVID lockdowns and so on accentuated, that we had this, more of the same kind of situation where people have been kept off their lands for centuries and millennia, and there's nothing new in this particular story. So I think that we do need to embrace models where there's greater senses of shared ownership and less exclusion, more inclusion, less exploitation, more caring relationships. And this is kind of what perhaps the lessons of, at least common law legal pluralism can kind of show, that there is not just the one way of relating to space, but there are ways in which we can spread ownerships and give a greater sense of propriety to, a majority of the people, such that, we have a stronger vested interest in them being kept well.
I think that sense of reciprocal relationality is really strong. Obviously, in the Australian context, that relates back, to Indigenous sovereignty and that sense of relationality. But I think more broadly, it's about understanding that idea of belonging is a really fundamental aspect of being human. That we're not separate. There was a really beautiful quote when someone was talking about the early commons, and it said that villagers who found themselves leaving their commons or leaving the areas that they had, that they shared with each other, wandered out of their knowledge. And I thought it was a really lovely way of sort of illustrating that sense of connection, that they were wandering away from themselves when they left their land, and they left their place of belonging. And I think reconnecting with that sense of belonging and that sense of sort of reciprocal relationality to place is something that there's a real yearning for, and that's probably the thing that is so interesting to keep exploring and to understand what that looks like and what sorts of models of governance, really provide for that and allow for that to flourish.
That's an incredibly positive image of not only just our relationship with land, but human life in general. Human flourishing. I think that model really would support that, as opposed to a lot of the issues that we've discussed, the accumulation of capital, and all of that. The fact that, I think there was another quote from your book that I found quite powerful. That and it's from medieval French jurist. Like, freedom is found from the depths of the forests, and I think that's something that we're able to hear now, because in the liberal paradigm, coming from John Locke, freedom is generally connected with ownership of property, developing property. I think there's this alternate narrative which I think we should all pay attention to, and I think the great value of your book is making that not only clear, but in such an interesting and in such a accessible way. The examples, the historical examples that you've used, are all very, some might be more familiar to the general public than others, but they're all very poignant, and they have a particular kind of humanity to them. Ultimately, they're all very human stories at the very end. Unfortunately, we might be running out of time here, and we'll have to unfortunately wrap up. But I would like to thank the both of you for agreeing to speak with us about your book. The book is published. It is currently available both at the publisher website at Edinburgh University Press, and I think it should be also available at the UNSW Library and Bookshop. Thank you very much again to Cristy and John.
Thank you so
Jay.
much for having us.
Yeah, it's lovely to speak with you. Thank you.